Investigators zero in on a theory that may explain the fatal accident that John F. Kennedy Jr., his wife Carolyn, and her sister Lauren. At the center of it all, a pilot in over his head.
Imagine being the most famous man in the world, flying a small plane over the dark ocean. Beside you is the woman you love, but you haven't been speaking for weeks. This flight was supposed to fix everything. Instead, the lights of the shore faded away, the plane dipped into the waves, and the fairy tale ended in total silence. This is the heartbreaking story of Carolyn and Kennedy. It was truly an end of an era. The broken hearts and the plane crash. The night of July 16, 1999, was hot, hazy, and thick with the kind of fog that makes you feel like the whole world is closing in. For John F. Kennedy Jr., the pressure felt exactly like that fog. He was the son of a fallen president, a man the entire world expected to be a hero. But that night, he was just a husband trying to do something right. He was heading to his cousin's wedding at Martha's Vineyard, but the mood inside his white and blue Piper Saratoga plane was far from celebratory. The heartbreak of this final flight started long before the engine even turned over. For months, John and his wife, Carolyn Kennedy, had been living in what friends called a war zone. They were arguing constantly. The paparazzi, photographers who followed them everywhere, had turned their lives into a nightmare. Carolyn was so sad and stressed that she almost didn't get on the plane at all. In fact, she had told friends she wasn't going. She was tired of the Kennedy family drama and tired of the cameras. But then, something shifted. Carolyn's sister, Lauren, stepped in. She didn't want the couple to give up. She convinced Carolyn that going to this wedding together was the only way to show the world and each other that they were still a team. Lauren even offered to fly with them so it wouldn't be awkward. Because of that one act of kindness, that one attempt to fix a broken heart, all three of them ended up in that cockpit on that fateful Friday night. As the sun began to set, the sky turned a weird, murky gray. John was still learning how to fly in the dark using only his instruments, but he was confident. He wanted to prove he could do it. He wanted to be the provider, the pilot, and the prince. But as they flew over the Atlantic Ocean, the haze became a wall. Without a clear horizon to look at, a pilot can get spatial disorientation. This is a fancy way of saying your brain gets tricked. You think you are flying straight, but you are actually tilting. You think you are climbing, but you are actually heading straight for the water. Inside the plane, it must have been terrifyingly quiet. We don't know if they were holding hands or if they were still mid-argument. What we do know is that the radar showed the plane making strange, jerky movements. John was struggling. He was lost in the dark, both literally and emotionally. He was trying to find the shore, trying to find a landing strip, trying to find a way back to the happy life they used to have. When the plane finally hit the water, it wasn't a movie-style explosion. It was a quick, violent thud into the cold Atlantic. The golden couple, who had everything, the looks, the money, the fame, were gone in a second, just that fast and quick. When the news broke the next morning, the world stopped. People left flowers outside their apartment in North Moore Street. They cried for a man they never met and a woman they only saw in magazines. The most heartbreaking part isn't just that they died, it's that they died while they were trying. They were trying to be better. They were trying to forgive. They were trying to fly through the fog of their own problems to get to the sunny side of their relationship. They were just a few miles away from the land when the ocean took them. They left behind a half-eaten dinner in their apartment and a dog that was waiting for a walk that would never happen. It was the ultimate what if. If they had waited one more hour for the fog to clear, or if they had taken a car instead, they might still be here today, gray-haired and happy. How tragic and heartbreaking, especially for a couple seen as golden, seemingly perfect, and an inspiration to many. But before the ocean claimed them and turned their love into a tragedy, there was a day in the sun where they thought they had finally outrun the cameras forever. Getting married in paradise, the secret escape. If you were the most famous man in America, How would you get married without 1,000 cameras flashing in your face? For John F. Kennedy Jr., the answer was to disappear. He didn't want a presidential wedding with thousands of guests and news helicopters circling overhead. He wanted to be just John, and he wanted Carolyn to be his wife, not a trophy for the tabloids. So, in September 1996, they headed to a tiny, remote place called Cumberland Island off the coast of Georgia. There were no paved roads, no luxury hotels, and most importantly, no paparazzi. The wedding was like something out of a dream, but a very simple one. They didn't get married in a giant cathedral. Instead, they chose a tiny wooden chapel called the First African Baptist Church. It was so small that the guests had to sit on plain wooden benches, and there wasn't even any electricity. The only light came from flickering candles that cast long shadows on the walls. It was quiet, peaceful, and private. For a few hours, the Prince of America and his bride were finally alone. Carolyn looked like a movie star, but in a way that was totally her own. She wore a simple pearl-colored silk dress that cost $40,000, but it didn't have any lace or giant puffy sleeves. It was sleek and modern, just like her. When she walked down the aisle, she wasn't just joining a family, she was joining a dynasty. But in that moment, she was just a woman in love. John was so happy that he reportedly cried when he saw her. He had finally found his partner, his equal, and someone who made him feel like he didn't have to be a Kennedy all the time. But even in paradise, the heartbreak was hiding just around the corner. The reason they had to go to such extremes to hide was because they were afraid. They weren't just afraid of the cameras. They were afraid that the Kennedy curse would find them if they made too much noise. John's life had been marked by tragedy since he was 3 years old, and he felt that if he could just keep this one thing, his marriage, secret, he could protect it. He wanted to build a wall around their love to keep the world out. The reception was held at a simple inn on the island. They danced to "Forever in My Life" by Prince. They ate cake and laughed with their closest friends. There were no reporters to ask them annoying questions. There were no fans screaming John's name. It was the only time in their entire relationship where they felt truly safe. John even gave a toast where he told his friends that he was the luckiest man alive because he had found someone who truly understood him. However, the paradise part of the wedding was a bit of an illusion. Even as they were saying their vows, John's best man and cousin, Anthony Radziwill, was secretly very sick with cancer. John was carrying the weight of his friend's illness on his shoulders while trying to smile for his bride. It was a reminder that even in the happiest moments of a Kennedy's life, sadness was always standing in the shadows. This contrast, the beautiful white dress against the dark reality of their lives, is what makes this part of the story so bittersweet. When the weekend was over, they had to leave the island. They had to get back on a plane and fly back to New York City. They knew that the moment they landed, the secret would be out. They were right. The second they arrived at their apartment in Tribeca, a wall of photographers was waiting for them. The peace of Cumberland Island was gone instantly. John had to step out and beg the press to leave his new wife alone, saying, "I just ask for any privacy or room you could give her." It was a heartbreaking plea because he knew deep down that they wouldn't listen. The wedding was the high point of their lives, the one moment where they were winning against the fame. But as they walked into their apartment that day, the door slammed shut on their privacy forever. They were no longer just a couple. They were public property. The paradise they found on that island was the last time they would ever truly feel free. The wedding was a dream, but the honeymoon ended the moment they stepped back onto the streets of New York and realized that being engaged had been much easier than being married under a microscope. Rocky engagement, the storm before the calm. Before they were the world's most famous newlyweds, John and Carolyn were just two people trying to figure out if they actually fit together. Most people think an engagement is supposed to be the happiest time in a person's life, but for them, it was a mountain of stress. John was the Prince of America, and the world had very specific ideas about who he should marry. For years, he had dated famous actresses and supermodels, including the movie star Daryl Hannah. When he finally chose Carolyn, a girl who wasn't a celebrity, it sent the media into a total frenzy. The heartbreak of their engagement started with the ghosts of John's past. Everywhere Carolyn looked, she saw reminders that she was being compared to the women who came before her. She wasn't just competing with John's ex-girlfriends, she was competing with the memory of his mother, Jackie Kennedy, who was the most famous First Lady in history. People wanted Carolyn to be a perfect, quiet doll, but she was a strong-willed modern woman with her own career and her own opinions. This created a friction that started to spark even before they said, "I do." The most famous and arguably most devastating moment of their engagement happened in a very public place, Washington Square Park in New York City. In February 1996, a paparazzo hidden in the bushes caught a video that shocked the world. It wasn't a video of a happy couple holding hands, it was a video of a screaming match. John and Carolyn were yelling at each other in the middle of the park. At one point, John actually tried to pull the engagement ring off Carolyn's finger. He looked frustrated and angry, and she looked absolutely exhausted. To a middle schooler today, a viral video is common, but back then, this was a national scandal. It showed the world that the golden couple wasn't perfect. They were human. They had tempers. They had doubts. The reason for the fight was simple but deep: the pressure. Carolyn was starting to realize that marrying John meant she would never have a private moment again. She was scared. John, on the other hand, was used to the attention and couldn't understand why she was so upset. This understanding gap was the first crack in the foundation of their relationship. During this rocky time, John was also trying to launch his own magazine called George. He wanted to prove he was more than just a famous face. He wanted to be a businessman. But starting a business is stressful. He was working long hours, traveling constantly, and trying to manage a staff. While he was busy trying to build an empire, Carolyn was left alone in their apartment, hiding from the photographers who were literally camping out on their doorstep. She felt abandoned, and he felt overwhelmed. They were two people in the same boat, but they were rowing in opposite directions. Even the way John proposed was a bit heartbreaking. He didn't do it at a fancy dinner or under the Eiffel Tower. He did it on a fishing boat in Martha's Vineyard. He gave her a ring that was a copy of a ring his father had given his mother. On one hand, it was a beautiful tribute to his parents. On the other hand, it was a heavy burden. It was a reminder that by saying yes, Carolyn was stepping into a role that had already been written for her. She wasn't just becoming Mrs. Kennedy. She was becoming a part of a historical legend that usually ended in sadness. There were many times during their engagement where friends thought they would break up. They were volatile, which is a fancy word for saying they had a lot of ups and downs. One minute they were deeply in love, kissing on a street corner, and the next they were shouting at each other, but despite the fights and the rings being pulled off, they couldn't stay away from each other. They had a magnetic connection that was both their greatest strength and their biggest weakness. They eventually made it to the altar, but the chaotic engagement left them both with emotional bruises. They entered their marriage not with a sense of peace, but with a sense of us against the world. They thought that once they were married, the world would leave them alone. They thought the rocky part was over. But as they would soon find out, the engagement was just the practice round for the real battle that was waiting for them back in the city. They hoped that becoming Mr. and Mrs. would act like a shield. But the moment they stepped back into their New York life, they realized that the cameras didn't want to celebrate their marriage. They wanted to consume it. Asking for privacy. The front door nightmare. If you've ever felt like someone was watching you, you know how creepy that feels. Now, imagine if 50 people were watching you every single time you opened your front door. Imagine they weren't just watching, but screaming your name, flashing bright lights in your eyes, and tripping you as you tried to walk to your car. This wasn't a horror movie for Carolyn and Kennedy. It was her Tuesday morning. The most heartbreaking part of her life with John wasn't a big dramatic fight. It was the slow, daily crushing of her spirit because she simply wanted to be left alone. John had grown up with cameras. To him, the paparazzi were like annoying mosquitoes. They buzzed around, they bit you, but you just swatted them away and kept walking. He had been America's prince since he was a toddler. He knew how to smile, wave, and keep moving. But Carolyn was different. She was a regular person from a regular family who happened to fall in love with a famous man. She didn't have fame muscles. She didn't know how to ignore the insults that photographers would yell at her just to get a reaction. They wanted her to cry or look angry because a sad photo sold for way more money than a happy one. The heartbreak really peaked right after their secret wedding. When they returned to their apartment in the Tribeca neighborhood of New York, the sidewalk was covered in people. It looked like a mosh pit at a concert. John actually had to stand on the steps of their building and give a speech. He looked tired and humbled. He literally begged the reporters, saying, "I just ask for any privacy or room you could give her as she makes an adjustment." It was a husband trying to protect his wife from a monster he couldn't actually kill. He was asking for a normal life, but in the world of the Kennedys, normal didn't exist. Because she was so scared to go outside, Carolyn started to become a prisoner in her own home. This is where the story gets really sad. She would stay inside for days. She would wait until the middle of the night to walk their dog Friday, just so she could breathe fresh air without a camera lens an inch from her nose. She stopped wearing bright colors and started wearing a uniform of tan, black, and white. She hoped that if she looked boring, the photographers would get tired of her. But it didn't work. The more she hid, the more they wanted to find her. The pressure changed who she was. Friends said she went from being a bubbly, funny girl who loved to dance to someone who was always looking over her shoulder. She started to feel like she couldn't trust anyone. Was the person next to her at the hair salon a real customer or a reporter undercover? Was her friend's assistant selling stories to the tabloids? This kind of paranoia is heartbreaking because it robs a person of their joy. Carolyn felt like she was living in a gilded cage. The cage was made of gold and lived in by a prince, but it was still a cage. John tried to help, but sometimes his help made it worse. He would tell her to just ignore it, which is easy to say but hard to do when people are mocking your shoes or your hair on the front page of every newspaper. This created a wall between them. John felt guilty that he had brought this nightmare into her life, and Carolyn felt resentful that he couldn't make it stop. They were living in a beautiful apartment filled with expensive things, but they were often sitting in silence, listening to the shutters of the cameras clicking outside their window like rain. There is a famous photo of Carolyn sitting on a curb, looking completely defeated. She isn't crying, she just looks done. It's the face of someone who realized that no matter how much she loved John, she might never be able to survive his world. She once told a friend that she felt like she was disappearing. The world was turning her into a character in a story, a fashion icon, or a moody wife. And they were forgetting that she was a real human being with feelings. This lack of privacy wasn't just annoying, it was a tragedy that was slowly dismantling their happiness piece by piece. But the cameras outside weren't the only problem. Inside the apartment, the paradise they had promised each other was starting to feel more like a pressure cooker. Trouble in Paradise, the gilded cage. By 1998, the golden couple was living a life that looked perfect on the outside. But inside their walls, things were starting to fall apart. This is the part of the story that feels the most human and the most painful. We often think that if we had millions of dollars, a beautiful home, and a famous name, all our problems would disappear. But for John and Carolyn, their fame was like a heavy backpack they could never take off. And eventually, it started to make them stumble. They were living in a gilded cage, a place that looks beautiful from the outside but feels like a prison to the people trapped inside. The trouble in their paradise came from three big directions: work, family, and expectations. John was working around the clock on his magazine, George. He poured his heart, soul, and a lot of his money into it. He wanted it to be a success so he could prove he was a serious person, not just a hunk on a magazine cover. But the magazine was struggling. Advertisers were leaving, and the stress of the business failing was making John moody and distracted. He was so focused on saving his professional dream that he didn't realize his personal life was drifting away. Meanwhile, Carolyn was struggling with her own type of work. Her job had become being a Kennedy, and she hated it. She felt like she was constantly being judged by John's big famous family. The Kennedys are known for being loud, athletic, and very competitive. Carolyn was more private and quiet. She didn't want to play touch football in front of a crowd of photographers. She wanted to have a quiet dinner with her husband. Because she skipped so many family events, people started to label her as difficult or icy. It's heartbreaking to think that she was actually just a girl who was overwhelmed and lonely. But the world saw her as a villain. As the stress grew, so did the arguments. Their apartment, which was supposed to be their sanctuary, became a place of tension. They began to live parallel lives. John would spend all day at the office and then go to the gym or go paragliding to blow off steam. Carolyn would stay home, often sitting in the dark to avoid being seen through the windows, or she would go out with her own small circle of friends who had nothing to do with the Kennedy world. They were like two ships passing in the night, even though they shared the same bed. Another layer of the heartbreak was their struggle to start a family. John really wanted to be a father. He wanted to have kids and give them the normal childhood he never had. But the couple was under so much stress that the timing never felt right. Carolyn reportedly felt that she couldn't bring a baby into their circus of a life. She didn't want a child to grow up being hunted by the paparazzi the same way she was. This disagreement caused a lot of sadness between them. It's a tragic what if. If they had been able to find peace, they might have had the family they both dreamed of. During this time, John was also dealing with the tragedy of his cousin and best friend Anthony, who was getting sicker and sicker. John felt like he had to be the strong one for everyone. He was the head of the family, the boss of a magazine, and the husband of a struggling wife. He was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders, and he didn't have anyone to tell him it was okay to be tired. He was trying to be a superhero, but he was just a man. The trouble in paradise wasn't because they stopped loving each other. In fact, most people say they were still deeply in love. The heartbreak is that love isn't always enough to protect you from the world. They were being pulled apart by forces they couldn't control. The history of the Kennedy name, the greed of the media, and the pressure of being perfect. They were two people who desperately wanted to be normal, but they were stuck in a life where normal was against the rules. They were fighting for their marriage, but the world was cheering for them to fail. As they felt more and more disconnected, they both began to search for comfort in the wrong places, trying to remember what it felt like to be seen as a person rather than a symbol, attempting normalcy and the final goodbye. In the final chapter of their lives, John and Carolyn were caught in a constant tug-of-war between a normal life and a total breakdown. They desperately wanted to be a regular couple, but the weight of the Kennedy name made that impossible. John tried to blend in by rollerblading through the streets of New York or eating a quiet slice of pizza on a park bench, while Carolyn tried to find peace by walking their dog, Friday, in the middle of the night. These were the sweet, simple moments where they felt like a real team, away from the flashing bulbs. But the peace never lasted. The gilded cage was always there, and eventually the bars began to feel too tight for them to breathe. The pressure eventually led to deep cracks in their foundation. Because they felt so misunderstood by the world, they began to feel misunderstood by each other. This is where the story takes a darker turn. Loneliness can make people do things they wouldn't normally do. Rumors began to swirl that Carolyn was seeking comfort in an old friend, a man from her past who made her feel like the regular girl she used to be before the cameras arrived. Whether the rumors of a secret kiss or a betrayal were 100% true or just tabloid gossip, the jealousy and hurt between John and Carolyn were very real. They were two people who still loved each other deeply, but were drowning in a sea of public expectations and private doubts. They reached a point where they were at a crossroads. They were either going to break up forever, or they were going to find a way to start over. The heartbreak is that they chose to try. On that final night in July 1999, Carolyn's sister, Lauren, acted as the bridge between them. She helped them put aside their recent fights to attend a family wedding together. They boarded that small plane not as a perfect golden couple, but as a real struggling one that had been through the fire and was trying to heal the wounds. When the plane disappeared into the Atlantic, it took away all the what-ifs. We will never know if they would have stayed together, or if they would have finally found the privacy they craved so badly. The most gut-wrenching part of their story is that they died while they were moving toward each other. They died in the middle of a reconciliation flight, trying to reach a new chapter in their marriage. Today, we remember them not just for their fashion or their fame, but for the tragedy of two people who had the whole world watching them, yet only ever truly wanted to be seen and understood by each other. They were born into a legend, lived in a storm, and died in a fog. In the end, they found their only true peace together, far away from the cameras, beneath the waves of the ocean. Their story remains a haunting reminder that even the most beautiful lives can be broken by the weight of a crown they never asked to wear. Their story proves that even the most perfect lives can hide a world of hurt, and sometimes the only way to find peace is to walk away from the spotlight together. If you found this deep dive interesting, make sure to subscribe for more untold stories.